Good afternoon. In today's Connect to Congress, I am joined by Congresswoman Veronica Escobar. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So we'll be talking about some various topics, pressing topics right now. We'll go ahead and get started. We'll start with the spending bill.
Yeah.
We avoided a government shutdown. A Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer, helped advance that bill. He said a shutdown would be worse than not advancing this bill. What are your thoughts on that?
It was a choice between two really, really bad options. On the one hand, the spending bill, which was crafted only by Republicans, they did not accept any of our input. It was not a normal spending bill when you have what's called a continuing resolution. Normally, when we don't pass our normal appropriations and we have a continuing resolution, it's status quo. In other words, everything stays as is until the end of that spending bill, if we can't reach an agreement. Well, this was not that. This not only made cuts, important cuts to the PACT Act, for example, which is a really important health care coverage for veterans, but more importantly, what it did that was terrifying was it lifted the guardrails so that Elon Musk and Donald Trump could continue to move around money and make cuts that were not approved by Congress. So it was a choice between that or a government shutdown, and a government shutdown is terrible. I was sworn into Congress as a freshman during a government shutdown. It's a lot of pain for a lot of people, but in the end, Donald Trump and Elon Musk are effectively shutting down the government right now as we speak in a violation of law. And my concern with supporting the CR is then you give them the legal backing to do some of this.
And here in El Paso, when you talk about the PACT Act, we are a big military veteran community. Talk to me about that impact specifically here in El Paso.
Yeah, it will be a devastating impact on top of a number of other devastating impacts. But the PACT Act was a bipartisan piece of legislation, the largest expansion of health care for our veterans in a generation, intended to help veterans who've been exposed to toxic burn pits or Agent Orange, veterans who had been denied coverage because they couldn't prove that their issue was service related. Well, the PACT Act essentially allowed us to cover veterans' health care because of that exposure. The bill that we passed, or I voted against it, but the continuing resolution that was passed last week plugged a hole in the funding that was required, a deficit that was required, but it didn't appropriate the funds going forward, which we need in order to make sure that we keep our promise. And so I'm really concerned about our ability to keep our promise to our veterans through the PACT Act.
Another thing that is making headlines today, specifically, El Pasoans Fighting Hunger Food Bank. So they got some major federal funding. They're making an announcement today about a shift in obviously the services that they provide for the community, a shift in who they employ. What are your thoughts on that, and what can be done to offset that money that they're going to be lacking?
El Pasoans Fighting Hunger serves a real need in our community, dealing with food insecurity for El Pasoans. The reason why El Pasoans Fighting Hunger is having to make adjustments, including laying people off and limiting the days of operation, is because of what's happening at the federal level. From food for communities like ours, to Medicare and programs for seniors, for children, for Americans with disabilities. The Trump-Musk administration and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, Republicans who have control of the House and the Senate, they are making deep cuts to programs in order to provide tax breaks to billionaires. That's what's happening right now. And the Congress, the House and the Senate, voted on a budget bill a few weeks ago, which offers sort of the framework for these cuts, but the committees are now working on the actual cuts. Once we have just how deep those cuts will be, we are going to be informing the community. but it will impact a lot of organizations, local governments, and people.
And El Pasoans Fighting Hunger Food Bank is obviously an organization that was helping El Pasoans in the community during the COVID era, and they kind of ramped up their services and ramped up, manpower there. Would you say that that need is still there today, perhaps because of inflation?
That need still is there today, and I can tell you I hear it all the time. And part of it is inflation, and there's a number of other factors, but obviously the price of groceries, none of that has improved in the last couple of months. And in fact, we've seen prices go up, and there is a real risk that we will see even higher spikes in prices as a result of tariffs. God forbid we go into a recession. But things are really uncertain for a lot of people right now, and El Pasoans Fighting Hunger fills that need that a lot of El Pasoans have.
Let's shift here to immigration. You recently visited Guantanamo Bay, and I know you've been vocal about being against sending migrants who are in the country illegally there. Talk to us about that visit. What was the facility like? What was it like there?
So I will tell you right now, one of our processing facilities in El Paso that can hold well over 1,000 people is pretty much empty. It's a facility that's been up and running and operational, and yet the Trump administration has decided to fly people from the mainland US, despite the fact that we have space here, in the United States for detention, but they've decided to fly people to Guantanamo Bay. And the mission, I was told, was to ultimately hold 30,000 people.
Right.
When I was there a week ago, there were fewer than 200, and they were already at capacity. So when I asked, how will you hold up to 30,000 people? I was shown these tents that cost the Department of Defense over $3 million.
So they added to the facility.
They added to the facility, but those tents, they could not put people in those tents because we're coming up on hurricane season and tropical storm season in that part of the world that sees a lot of that weather activity. And a lot of the questions that I had went unanswered. I asked, what is the cost per day per person? Again, with the context that here in El Paso, we've got the processing facility that is, virtually empty, and at the same time, the federal government is cutting programs to the elderly, to children, to veterans. Why are we spending tens of millions of dollars to stand up this facility where there can be very little congressional oversight, where people don't have access to their attorneys? There were just a lot of questions about cost, about process, and frankly that there really is no need for it. And so it led me to believe that it was really just for show at the expense of the American taxpayer.
What were the conditions like there?
There were two different sets of facilities. One set of facilities for nonviolent immigrants, or immigrants without any kind of criminal background, rather. Has nothing to do with violence or nonviolent, but no criminal background. And those were like bunkers, basically. Okay. And across the bay, next to the post 9/11 people that are still being detained by the U.S., space was made for immigrants that, according to DHS, had some kind of link to criminal activity. And they, those were like jail pods, kind of what you would see with a normal jail, but they were at capacity. There was no space for any more people unless they were put in tents, in which case it would call into question the safety of staff and personnel and the immigrants on the island should there be a tropical storm or a hurricane.
Wow, and we're being told that ICE facilities here are also at capacity, and so what happens then?
Here's the kind of conundrum that the Trump administration has created. They are firing people who can assist with the processing of many of these cases. And so they're letting go the personnel that can help move the system, but at the same time, they're asking FBI and DEA and other agencies to step away from their normal duties, law enforcement activities that keep Americans safe, in order to address this mass deportation plan that Trump has, without the personnel to expedite it. And so it's creating this bottleneck that is super expensive and essentially a self-determined bottleneck, so that he can keep his campaign promise of deporting millions of people.
And just recently, he invoked the Enemies Alien Act of 1798. Also, just this weekend, there was mass deportation of who he claims to be Tren de Aragua members this weekend. What are your thoughts on him invoking that? And do you really believe a majority of these migrants are Tren de Aragua gang members?
I want to be totally clear. We have laws on the books for deportation of people who have criminal backgrounds or have committed wrongdoing while in the country. Nobody argues with that legislation that's been on the books, and there have been deportations ongoing, regardless of who's been in the White House, of people who have those criminal backgrounds. And so you won't get any argument from me about the need to deport people who are in our country to do us harm. The problem with what's going on right now, number one, we're not at war. It is an act that comes during a time of war. We are not at war with any country right now. But there's a larger issue that I think all Americans should be deeply concerned about, irrespective of the fact that it has to do with immigration or immigration enforcement. And that is that we have a president who not only violated the law as written by Congress when it comes to our spending, by mass firings and mass closures of agencies and personnel, but now it looks like he ignored a court order. And I know the administration is doing this as it's linked to immigration, as a way to point at critics and say, aha, you must be in favor of criminal organizations being in the country. That's why I say there's laws on the books that all of us agree should be enforced. But what we should all be concerned about is when you have a president who violates a court order, we then absolutely will spiral into a constitutional crisis. Anyone who has studied US government knows there's checks and balances. There's the courts, there's the legislative branch, there's the executive branch. Our founders created those checks and balances so that we wouldn't have a king, so that we wouldn't have one person with so much authority that that person could do whatever they wanted to while being unchecked. I'm afraid we are pretty close to, if not in, a constitutional crisis.
And what does something like this do to our relationship with other countries and neighboring countries?
That's a whole other conversation as well. We have seen the administration, separate and apart from what's going on in the immigration space, we've seen our White House, we've seen the president essentially attack our allies like Canada, like Mexico, European nations. We saw him berate the president of Ukraine, an ally who's fighting for democracy in his own country. We've seen that rejection of our allies, and we've seen an embrace of our adversaries, like Vladimir Putin. And it has been a shocking reversal of the global world order, especially post-World War II. I think about all the veterans that I have had the privilege of meeting over my time in Congress, veterans who fought bravely during World War II. Many of them, as I've met with them recently, have been shocked and stunned by what's happening in terms of the reversal of the post-World War II order. This is not the way that the U.S. should engage, rejecting our allies and embracing our adversaries. One day we will need our allies. We have needed them in the past. And there's a reason why alliances work. When we stand together for democracy, when we stand together for freedom, it appears as though we have a president who wants us to stand alone.
And then, but before we go here, I wanted to go back to the immigration situation. So, when the president is conducting these mass deportations, again, we go back to the threat of Tren de Aragua, and that has been a name that has been, at the forefront of these mass deportations for months. But just recently, we held a conversation with local law enforcement agencies, and the Border Patrol Sector Interim Chief did say that there has been a TDA threat for the past 3 years, saying that because El Paso was one of the lead sectors seeing Venezuelan migrants come into the U.S. illegally, in turn also seeing that TDA encounter be pretty high up. How big do you think this threat is here specifically in the borderland area, and what is the alternative to what President Trump is doing to keep the threat at bay? Yeah,
I do think our HSI, Homeland Security Investigative Personnel, should be focused on high threats. I do believe that ICE personnel should be focused on the high threats. We all want a country and communities that are safe and secure. That should be our number one priority, right, is making sure that we have safe, secure communities and that we have national security threats that we are addressing quickly. I can tell you I have been receiving classified briefings on Capitol Hill about TDA. Obviously, I'm not going to divulge what I have heard in classified briefings. I can tell you that TDA is not considered the highest threat that we face in the country when it comes to transnational criminal organizations. I can also tell you that based on CBP's own data, their focus has not strictly been criminal organizations or individuals with criminal backgrounds. I have to stress, every administration has focused mostly on criminal threats and national security threats. Deportations have never stopped, not during the Biden administration, not during the Obama administration, not during Trump 1.0. Professionals have been doing their job to keep us safe regardless of administration. What we are seeing per CBP's numbers nationally is that the net has been cast so broad in order to meet the quota system that Tom Homan has put in place, Donald Trump's border czar, that people with legal status have been caught up in it, and U.S. citizens have been caught up in it. And when you have a quota system nationally, that means personnel have to meet that quota. And I'm not sure every community is operating with the quota. I definitely have gotten reports of quotas operating in many major American cities. And if you're just being made to show a number, there sometimes can be carelessness. One of my colleagues, Don Beyer in Virginia, shared a local news story, which I shared as well on social media, of a U.S. citizen being detained at gunpoint because he looked like he was undocumented. Turns out, not only was he a U.S. citizen, but he was a Trump voter who, in his interview, said, I thought they were going to focus on criminals, not on people like me. And we are seeing more and more examples and cases of people who had legal protections who are being pulled into this system. That doesn't make us safer. That doesn't keep us safer. We also know that the administration is pulling agents and other law enforcement agencies off of their mission set to do this. When you're not chasing fentanyl and you're chasing people with legal protections, that doesn't make us safer. When you're no longer engaged in FBI functions that protect communities, that doesn't make us safer. And so I don't believe any of this is making us safer. I think a focus on criminal activity and those with criminal backgrounds, which has been done historically, needs to be the focus.
Have you gotten any briefings, or do you have any updated information on the migrant facility that's planned here at Fort Bliss?
When I was on the Guantanamo trip last week, we had DOD, Department of Defense, and Department of Homeland Security personnel on the trip with us. And I specifically asked about that, and what I heard back, because it's been hard for us to get information from the administration. There's not been a whole lot of transparency, which has been challenging, not just for me, but even for some of my Republican colleagues who've privately complained to me that they're not able to get certain answers to their questions. But what I was told last week was that a final decision had not yet been made, but that it was highly likely.
Okay.
And so
the press secretary, Sheila said it's coming, but not any detailed information.
It's not been formally announced. And you know, whenever we use military installations, whether it's Guantanamo, whether it's Fort Bliss, any other military installation, and military personnel as well, for DHS-related functions, there's never been a case at Fort Bliss where we've used it to detain people in advance of deportation. That harms our military. It sets our readiness back. It degrades the military altogether. And we know this is a time of instability, and anyone who cares about our national defense, I believe, should join with those of us who are opposed to using military installations like Fort Bliss for these purposes.
Congresswoman Escobar, thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon, for taking the time to be here. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Anything big coming up in Washington that you'd like to share with us?
There's so much. I'll have to come back.
You do, right? We need another 30 minutes. Thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon.
My pleasure.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.